The woman who walked into the Hall of Endless Night carried 3 languages in her mouth and absolutely no illusions about what she was walking into. Lorelei Brennan had translated peace accords before. She'd sat between warlords in basement rooms that smelled like copper and old hatred, parsed ceasefires in 7 dialects, watched men with blood on their hands try to find words that meant something other than surrender. But she'd never worked for the dead. The assignment brief had been clinical. 6 weeks in the vampire realm, mediating territorial disputes between the Court of Ashen Crowns and 3 human cities that had grown too close to their underground borders. Payment up front. Hazard bonus if she survived. Her supervisor at the International Mediation Bureau had actually used those words. The hall stretched ahead like the rib cage of something ancient and hollowed out. Obsidian columns rose into darkness that the scattered torchlight couldn't touch. The floor was black marble veined with silver, and her footsteps echoed despite the carpet runner someone had laid down in a concession to human comfort. The vampires didn't need it. They moved like water over stone, silent and inevitable. There were 12 of them, arranged around a table that looked older than most countries. Lorelei recognized the formal positioning from the documents she'd studied during the 3-day journey underground. The king at the head, his high council flanking him in order of blood seniority, 2 empty seats reserved for human representatives who hadn't arrived yet, probably having second thoughts. Smart. The king was exactly as terrifying as the myth suggested and nothing like the paintings tried to capture. Zephyrion Yvaros sat perfectly still in a throne-like chair that might have been carved from a single massive bone. His hair fell past his shoulders in a cascade of white so pure it seemed to drink the torchlight and give back something colder. His skin held the bloodless pallor every vampire wore like a banner of pride, stretched over features that were all sharp angles and aristocratic cruelty. He wore black and deep crimson, formal robes that belonged in a different century, and when his eyes lifted to track her approach across the hall, they were the color of old silver tarnished almost to black. He didn't blink, didn't breathe, just watched with the absolute focus of a predator deciding whether something qualified as prey. Lorelei had prepared for this. She'd practiced her entrance, her greeting, the exact angle of her bow that showed respect without submission. The Bureau had been very specific about posture. Show weakness here, and you'd spend 6 weeks fighting for every scrap of authority. Show arrogance, and you'd insult beings who remembered when her country was just forest and optimistic colonists. She stopped at the appropriate distance, set her document case on the floor beside her, and inclined her head exactly 30 degrees. Your Majesty, High Council, I am Lorelei Brennan, appointed translator and mediator for the territorial negotiations. I'm honored by your invitation and ready to begin whenever you are. Silence stretched. One of the council members, a woman whose white hair was braided with what looked like actual bone charms, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something in a language Lorelei didn't recognize. Several others watched her with expressions ranging from bored to vaguely hungry. The king said nothing. Lorelei waited. This was also part of the strategy. Don't fill silence just because it's uncomfortable. Let them make the first move. Finally, Zephyrion Yvaros shifted slightly in his seat. It was the first movement she'd seen him make, and it sent a ripple of response through the other vampires, like birds reacting to a hawk spreading its wings. You're younger than expected. His voice was low, perfectly modulated, with an accent she couldn't place. It sounded like several languages arguing underneath English. I'm 26, and I've mediated 43 treaties, Lorelei said. My age hasn't been a problem yet. Yet. He let the word hang there. The human delegations were supposed to arrive simultaneously with you. Where are they? Delayed. They'll be here tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening, we lose a full day of negotiations. The agreement was 60 days to settle borders and resource rights. We're now at 59. Then we'll work faster. Lorelei met his eyes directly, another calculated risk. If you'd prefer to start with preliminary documents tonight, I can brief you on the human positions and we can identify potential compromise points before they arrive. The bone charm woman made a soft sound that might have been a laugh or a threat. Bold for a human. Does she not know how many translators we've eaten? None in the last century, Seraphine. Another council member said mildly. We're civilized now. Civilized is a strong word for this court. Someone else muttered. Zephyrion raised one hand slightly, and the murmuring stopped like he'd severed it with a blade. His attention remained fixed on Lorelei with an intensity that made her skin prickle despite her professional composure. You came alone through our tunnels. You stand in a room with 12 of the oldest vampires on this continent, and you propose working tonight, past midnight, which, if I understand human biology correctly, means you'll be exhausted tomorrow when the actual negotiations begin. He tilted his head fractionally. Explain your strategy. Lorelei had expected condescension, maybe threats, possibly some theatrical display of power meant to unsettle her. She hadn't expected genuine curiosity. It threw her for exactly 3 seconds before she adjusted. I function well on minimal sleep, and first impressions matter. If I brief you tonight, you'll see I actually understand the material, and you'll spend less time tomorrow testing whether I'm competent. We'll save 4 or 5 hours of posturing. She paused. Yours, not mine. Something changed in the king's expression, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of where a smile used to live before it died of neglect. You think we posture. Everyone postures in treaty negotiations. It's tedious but traditional. And you'd like to skip tradition? I'd like to finish this treaty before all 60 days run out and both sides decide they'd rather go back to skirmishing over territory like children fighting over toys. The silence that followed was different, sharper. Lorelei realized half a second too late that she might have pushed too far with the children comment, but Zephyrion Yvaros did something unexpected. He rose from his chair in one fluid motion that barely disturbed the air, moved down the length of the table with that unnatural vampire grace, and stopped directly in front of her. This close, he was taller than she'd estimated, easily 6'3", maybe taller. The temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees in his immediate presence. His eyes were worse up close because she could see the rings of darker gray within the silver, like storm systems viewed from space. What do you know about posturing, Lorelei Brennan? He used her full name like he was tasting it. I know it wastes time we don't have, she said, holding her ground despite every instinct screaming to step back. I know both sides are here because the alternative is war nobody can afford. And I know if we spend the first week of negotiations with everyone performing dominance displays and testing boundaries, we'll run out of time for the actual hard compromises. Zephyrion studied her face like he was reading text written on her skin. You've done this before. 43 times. With vampires? No, with humans who are just as good at killing as you are, just messier about it. This time, several council members reacted, sharp, indrawn breaths that weren't about breathing so much as performative shock. The king's expression didn't change at all. You compare us to humans. I compare negotiations to negotiations. Violence is violence. Territory is territory. If you're going to be offended by me treating this like every other treaty I've worked on, tell me now, and I'll adjust. But I was hired for my experience, and my experience says brutal honesty saves more time than pretty lies. For a long moment that stretched like taffy, Zephyrion Yvaros simply looked at her. Then he turned back to his counsel. Clear the hall. I'll do the preliminary review with the translator alone. Protest erupted immediately. Seraphine half rose from her seat. Your Majesty, the protocols are mine to set. Leave. The command carried weight that went beyond volume. One by one, the council members stood, some with obvious reluctance, others with knowing looks exchanged behind the king's back. Within 2 minutes, the Hall of Endless Night was empty, except for Lorelei, Zephyrion, and the guttering torches casting their insufficient light. The king returned to his seat, but didn't sit. Instead, he braced both hands on the table and regarded her across the expanse of dark wood. You'll tell me the truth about something. If I can. Why did the Bureau send someone young and female to negotiate with vampires? I've seen their previous mediators. Career diplomats, men in their 50s with military backgrounds. His eyes narrowed slightly. What made you the choice for this? Lorelei had wondered when this would come up. You want the official answer or the real one? There's a difference? The official answer is that I have the highest success rate of any active mediator, and I speak 7 languages, including 3 vampire dialects. The real answer is that I'm expendable enough that if you kill me, it won't start a political incident, but competent enough that if I succeed, the Bureau gets the credit. Zephyrion processed this in silence. You know you're expendable, and you came anyway. The pay is excellent, and I'm good at not dying. She pulled out the chair nearest her and sat without waiting for permission, then started unpacking documents from her case. Can we start with territorial boundaries? That's usually the easiest to compromise on. For the first time since she'd entered the hall, the king looked genuinely surprised. You're not afraid. I'm terrified. but I'm also professional. Most humans can't think when they're terrified. The scent alone makes them stupid. Lorelei looked up from sorting papers. What scent? Fear. You smell like fear and something else. Determination, maybe. Stubbornness. He tilted his head again in that bird of prey movement. It's unusual. I'll try to be less unusual if it's distracting. I didn't say it was distracting. He finally sat, pulling his chair forward with one hand. Show me the territorial proposals. They worked through midnight and into the small hours of morning. Zephyrion Yvaros was sharp in ways Lorelei hadn't anticipated. He caught discrepancies in the human delegation's demands, identified weak points in their reasoning, and proposed counteroffers that were aggressive but not insulting. He also asked questions, real questions, not rhetorical power plays. Why did the northern city want access to certain tunnels? What was the actual resource they needed versus what they claimed to need? How much of the dispute was territorial pride versus legitimate security concerns? Lorelei found herself explaining human city politics, economic pressures, the complicated web of municipal governments trying to manage expansion near vampire territory. He listened like he was cataloging every detail for future use. Around 3 a.m, she made a mistake with a date reference, and he corrected her instantly. That treaty was signed in 1847, not 1848. I was there. She stopped writing. You were there. I signed it. Different name, but yes. The casual mention of a lifetime that spanned centuries jolted her out of the rhythm they'd established. She'd been treating him like a difficult but intelligent negotiating partner. The reminder that he was something fundamentally other, something that measured time differently than she did, brought back the wrongness of the situation. Zephyrion noticed her pause. Problem? No, just adjusting context. She made the correction on her notes. What was the original dispute about? Cattle grazing near our feeding grounds. The humans thought we were taking their livestock. We were, but only because they had expanded into our territory first. He leaned back in his chair. Same problem, different century. Humans grow, we resist. Eventually someone proposes a treaty that lasts about 50 years before we repeat the cycle. You don't think this will work? I think this will work exactly as long as both sides find it convenient, and then we'll be back here with different mediators negotiating different lines on different maps. He said it without bitterness. Just fact. But we'll try anyway because the alternative is worse. Lorelei set down her pen. You're very cynical for a king. I'm very old for a king. Cynicism comes with the years. How old? Rude question. You just told me you signed a treaty in 1847. That doesn't mean I'll tell you my age, but his tone had shifted slightly, less formal. Old enough to have seen this pattern repeat, young enough to still pretend it matters. They kept working. Lorelei's exhaustion started catching up with her around 4:30. She caught herself reading the same paragraph 3 times without comprehension. Zephyrion noticed before she could hide it. You need sleep. I need to finish this section. You need sleep, or you'll be useless tomorrow. Today. He corrected himself, glancing toward the distant darkness where dawn was probably happening in the world above. I'll have someone show you to your quarters. I thought vampires didn't care about human frailty. We don't. But I need you functional, which means keeping you alive and rested. He stood that same fluid movement that didn't disturb the air around him. Besides, you were right about the posturing. This was more productive than tomorrow's opening session will be. Lorelei gathered her papers back into the case, movements sluggish with tiredness. Thank you for your time, Your Majesty. Zephyrion, if we're working closely, use my name. She looked up, surprised again. That's not protocol. Protocol is for public consumption. We're alone. He gestured toward a door she hadn't noticed, hidden in the shadows between columns. Your rooms are through there. Rooms are 3 floors up. I've assigned you a human attendant who will help you navigate the realm. His name is Marcus. Don't trust him. Lorelei paused halfway to the door. Excuse me? Marcus reports to the council. Everything you say to him will be analyzed for weakness. If you need something genuinely private, tell me directly. Zephyrion said this calmly, like he was discussing weather. Welcome to vampire politics. And should I trust you? Absolutely not, but at least I'm honest about being untrustworthy. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but closer than before. Sleep well, Lorelei Brennan. Tomorrow will be significantly worse than tonight. He was correct. The formal negotiations started at sunset with both human delegations arriving in armored vehicles that looked like they expected an ambush. The delegates were exactly what Lorelei had predicted. 2 career politicians with military advisors, all men over 50, all radiating the kind of aggressive diplomacy that came from being deeply uncomfortable and overcompensating. Richard Harlow represented the northern cities. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and had the kind of voice that filled rooms whether you wanted it to or not. His counterpart, James Fletcher, spoke for the Eastern Territories and seemed to view the entire negotiation as a personal insult requiring constant vocal objection. Within the first hour, they'd managed to insult the Vampire Court's territorial claims, question the king's authority to negotiate, and demand concessions that Lorelei knew from her preliminary research were completely unacceptable. Zephyrion sat through it with inhuman patience, his expression carved from ice, while his council members radiated barely suppressed rage. Seraphine looked ready to tear out throats. Another council member, Matthias, kept flexing his hands like he was imagining them around someone's neck. Lorelei translated back and forth, softening the worst of both sides' language while trying to preserve the substance of their positions. It was exhausting work, made worse by Richard Harlow's tendency to speak over her translations and James Fletcher's habit of questioning her word choices. By the third hour, her voice was raw and her patience was gone. "Gentlemen," she said, interrupting Fletcher mid-rant about feeding grounds, "if I could suggest we take a short recess—" "We don't need a recess," Fletcher snapped. "We need these creatures to understand that human territory is non-negotiable." The temperature in the hall dropped noticeably. Seraphine made a sound low in her throat that promised violence. Zephyrion raised one hand in that same small gesture, and everyone froze. "Creatures," he repeated softly. Interesting choice of words. Fletcher had the sense to look nervous, but not enough sense to back down. "I meant no offense, but we need to establish clear terms. Your kind has been encroaching on human land for decades. Our kind existed on this land centuries before your cities were dust in some architect's imagination," Zephyrion said, still in that deadly quiet voice. "We've shown considerable restraint in not simply reclaiming what was always ours. Perhaps you'd like to rephrase your demands." The 2 human delegates exchanged looks. Richard Harlow cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, I think what my colleague means—" "I know what he means. I'd like to hear him say it with more respect or less at all." The standoff stretched. Lorelei could see the negotiation collapsing in real time, weeks of work evaporating because grown men couldn't control their pride and fear. She made a decision that probably violated a dozen bureau protocols. "This isn't working," she said clearly. "We need different room arrangements." Everyone looked at her. Zephyrion's expression was unreadable. "Explain," he said. "The formal hall setup is making everyone defensive. Too much distance, too much performance. Let me propose something different." She pulled out her tablet, pulled up a room diagram. Smaller room, round table, no throne, no military advisors, just the primary decision makers and me translating. We'll get more done in 2 hours than we will in 2 weeks like this. Fletcher looked scandalized. "That's completely inappropriate. The protocols are why we're not making progress." Lorelei cut in. "Your Majesty, you asked me to make this work. This is how we make it work. Unless you'd prefer to spend the next 58 days listening to my voice go hoarse while we all pretend we're not wasting time." Silence. The council members watched their king with that same intense attention she'd noticed yesterday, waiting for his lead. Zephyrion stood. "We'll adjourn for tonight. Tomorrow, new arrangements as the translator suggests. Smaller room, fewer attendants." He fixed both human delegates with a look that probably featured in their future nightmares. "And considerably more respect, or I'll negotiate directly with your city councils and leave you here to explain why you were replaced." The dismissal was absolute. Within minutes, the hall emptied, leaving Lorelei alone with her documents and the sinking feeling that she'd just made herself a target for everyone's frustration. Bold move. She turned. Zephyrion had materialized behind her without sound. She was going to have to get used to that. It was necessary. It was political suicide. Both delegations will complain to your bureau that you're biased toward the vampire position. My council will assume you're maneuvering for private access to me for your own purposes. He studied her with that unsettling focus. "Why did you do it?" Because this treaty matters and we were failing. Someone had to change the dynamic. And you volunteered yourself as the sacrifice. I volunteered myself as the solution. She met his eyes. Will it work? The smaller room? Yes. He said it with certainty. Fear makes humans loud. Smaller space, less room to hide behind performance. They'll have to actually negotiate. He paused. You understand people. It's my job. Your job is translation. Understanding people is something else. He moved past her toward the main doors, then stopped and looked back. The council wants me to replace you. They think you're too disruptive. Lorelei's stomach dropped. Are you going to? No. You're the first interesting thing to happen in this realm in decades. I'm keeping you. He said it casually, like he was discussing furniture. But you should know you've made enemies tonight. Seraphine especially. She doesn't trust humans, and she trusts bold human women even less. Noted. Anything else I should know? Yes. Stop apologizing for taking up space. You were right and they were wrong. Own it. He pushed open the massive doors. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be worse before it's better. The smaller room worked. Over the next 2 weeks, the negotiations transformed from theatrical combat to actual progress. The round table forced everyone into proximity. Without advisors and attendants, the delegates had to speak for themselves. Lorelei translated, but also pushed back when either side was being unreasonable, calling out bad faith arguments and highlighting areas of potential compromise. Zephyrion proved to be a better negotiator than she'd expected. He was ruthlessly logical, but also surprisingly willing to concede points that didn't matter in exchange for protections that did. When Richard Harlow demanded access to certain tunnel systems, Zephyrion countered with security protocols that satisfied both sides. When Fletcher insisted on feeding restrictions, the king proposed monitoring systems that actually strengthened vampire accountability. They were making progress, real progress, the kind that might actually hold. Lorelei fell into a rhythm. Sleep during the day in her assigned quarters, which were surprisingly comfortable. Wake around sunset, review documents over a meal Marcus brought her while reporting everything to whoever he reported to. Negotiate from full dark until the early morning hours. Then, an hour or two of post-session work with Zephyrion, reviewing what happened and planning the next day's strategy. Those late-night sessions became something she looked forward to. Alone with the king, she got glimpses of the person underneath the formal persona. He was sharp and funny in a dry, cutting way. He told stories about previous failed treaties, about vampire politics that made human bureaucracy look simple. He asked questions about the human world with genuine curiosity, how cities worked now, what had changed in the last century, why humans were so obsessed with growth and expansion when they only lived 80 years if they were lucky. Seems inefficient, he said one night, reviewing a proposed compromise on feeding grounds. You spend the first 20 years learning how to function, the next 20 making mistakes, and then you've got maybe 40 years of actual competence before your bodies start failing. Some of us make it work, Lorelei said, making notes on her tablet. How old are you again? 26? So still in the mistake-making phase. She looked up. Was that an insult? An observation. Though you're more competent than most humans twice your age, so perhaps my theory needs adjustment. He set down the document he'd been reading. Why did you become a translator? The question surprised her. They'd kept things professional despite the growing ease between them. Languages came naturally, seemed practical. That's not an answer. It's the answer I give at bureau parties. We're not at a bureau party. Lorelei considered how much to say. But it was 3 a.m, and they'd been working together for 2 weeks, and she was tired of performing for everyone. My parents were diplomats. I grew up moving between countries, never staying anywhere long enough to make real friends. Languages were how I connected with people. Translating made me feel useful. She shrugged. And I'm good at it. You're very good at it, but that's not why you do it. No. You do it because you're trying to fix things. Bring people together. Make peace where there's conflict. His eyes caught the torchlight, reflecting it back silver. It's compulsive. I've watched you. Even when both sides are being idiotic, you keep trying to find the bridge between them. That's literally my job description. It's more than that. It's who you are. He said it with certainty that felt invasive. You can't stand discord. You need to fix it. Lorelei felt exposed in a way she didn't like. And that's a problem? It's dangerous. People will use that. They'll create conflict just to watch you exhaust yourself trying to solve it. Speaking from experience? Zephyrion's expression shuddered. For a moment she thought she'd crossed some line, but then he stood and walked to the window alcove that looked out over the underground city. I had someone like you once. Long time ago. She thought she could fix everything too. His voice was carefully neutral. She was wrong. Lorelei waited. He didn't elaborate. What happened to her? She asked quietly. She died trying to save people who didn't deserve saving, and I learned that caring about things makes you weak. He turned back to face her. So I stopped caring. It's simpler. Is it working? It was, until you showed up and started making me reconsider. The admission hung between them, too honest for 3 a.m. Lorelei didn't know what to say to it. Zephyrion seemed to realize he'd revealed too much because he moved back to the table with swift efficiency. That's enough for tonight. We'll tackle the resource rights tomorrow. Zephyrion! Go sleep, Lorelei. That's an order. She went, but she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. The grief underneath his careful neutrality, the way he described caring as weakness. She'd seen him in negotiations sharp and controlled, giving nothing away. But in these late-night sessions, cracks showed. Tiny glimpses of someone who'd felt things once and trained himself to stop. It made her ache in ways she didn't want to examine. The breakthrough came during week 3 over the most contentious issue, feeding rights. Human delegates wanted strict prohibitions on vampire feeding within city limits. The Vampire Council insisted on maintaining traditional access to volunteer feeding programs they'd established decades ago. Richard Harlow was being particularly stubborn. We can't have vampires roaming freely through residential areas. The public won't accept it. We've maintained feeding agreements for 80 years without incident, Zephyrion countered. Your cities benefit from our presence. We control criminal elements you can't touch, provide security in areas your police won't patrol. This isn't negotiable. Everything is negotiable. That's why we're here. Not this. The feeding programs protect humans as much as they serve us. Remove them, and we're back to hunting, which I assure you serves neither side. Fletcher jumped in. You're threatening us? I'm explaining reality. Vampires feed. The question is whether we do it within structures that ensure everyone's safety or whether we revert to older, messier methods. The argument spiraled. Lorelei translated back and forth, watching the progress they had made start to unravel over pride and fear. She tried several times to suggest compromises, but both sides were too entrenched. Finally, Seraphine, who'd been silent for most of the negotiations, spoke up from her position at Zephyrion's right hand. Perhaps we should ask our translator what she thinks. The words were poisonous sweet. She's human. She must have opinions about vampires drinking from her kind. Everyone looked at Lorelei. It was a trap, obviously. Answer wrong, and she'd alienate one side or both. But she was exhausted from 3 weeks of careful diplomacy, and Seraphine's condescension broke something. I think you're all being children, she said clearly. The feeding programs work. The statistics prove it. Crime is down in districts with vampire oversight. Volunteer programs are well regulated and participants are compensated fairly. The only reason you want to remove them is because they make you uncomfortable, and discomfort isn't a valid negotiating position. Fletcher's face went red. That's completely inappropriate. What's inappropriate is watching you waste 3 weeks because you can't admit you're afraid. I understand. Vampires are terrifying, but Veer doesn't change facts, and the facts support maintaining the feeding agreements with updated oversight protocols. You're supposed to be neutral, Harlow said coldly. I'm supposed to facilitate a treaty that works. This works. Your emotional resistance doesn't. Seraphine was smiling, which was worse than her anger. Strong opinions for a fragile human. Tell me, translator, would you volunteer for a feeding program? Put your blood where your mouth is? The challenge was blatant. Lorelei felt the trap closing but couldn't see the escape route. If it was part of demonstrating the safety and efficacy of the program, yes. The room erupted. Fletcher was shouting about impartiality. Harlow was demanding she be removed from the negotiations. 2 council members were arguing in rapid vampire dialect, and Zephyrion sat perfectly still, his attention fixed on Lorelei with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Finally he stood, and silence crashed down like a hammer. Enough! His voice carried absolute authority. The translator's personal willingness is irrelevant. We're discussing policy, not demonstrations. Seraphine, your baiting is beneath you. Gentlemen, your outrage is performing exactly the fear she accused you of. He turned to Lorelei. Your argument is noted. We'll table feeding rights until tomorrow and move to resource allocation. The session continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Lorelei felt like she was standing on cracking ice. She'd broken the cardinal rule. She'd stopped being neutral. Worse, she'd admitted she trusted the vampires more than she supported her own species' fear. When they finally adjourned near dawn, Zephyrion dismissed everyone except Lorelei. Stay. She stayed. He waited until the room was completely empty before speaking. That was either very brave or very stupid. I'm thinking stupid, Lorelei admitted. Her hands were shaking slightly with adrenaline crash. I should have stayed neutral. You should have, but you were right. He moved closer, that predator grace that never quite looked human. Seraphine was testing you. She wanted to know where your loyalties actually fall. And now she knows I'm compromised. Now she knows you prioritize truth over politics. That's different. He was standing very close now, close enough that she could see the complex silver patterns in his irises. Were you telling the truth? About volunteering? I don't know. Maybe. It seemed like the right thing to say. You don't strike me as someone who says things just because they sound right. I'm too tired to know what I mean anymore, Lorelei said honestly. I've been negotiating for 3 weeks straight. Everything is blurring together. Zephyrion studied her face with that unnerving focus. When did you last take a full day's rest? I rest every day while you're sleeping. That's not rest. That's unconsciousness between work sessions. When did you last do something that wasn't related to this treaty? She tried to remember and came up blank. I don't know. Tomorrow night, no negotiations. I'm declaring a recess day. We don't have time for that. We're barely halfway through. Tomorrow night, no negotiations, he repeated firmly. You're burning out and I need you functional. That's an order from the king, not a request from your negotiating partner. Lorelei wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted. Fine, a recess day. Good, go sleep. She gathered her materials and headed for the door, but his voice stopped her. Lorelei. She turned back. What you said tonight, about the feeding programs being safe and effective. He paused, something complicated moving behind his eyes. You actually believe that? The data supports it. That's not what I asked. She met his gaze. Yes, I believe it. I've reviewed every incident report from the last decade. Volunteer feeding programs are safer for humans than letting vampires hunt. That's not opinion, it's mathematics. You trust us. I trust structures and oversight. The programs have both. That's still trust. He said it like he was testing the word. Most humans never get there. Even the ones who work with us keep us at arm's length. I'm not most humans. No. Something in his expression shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. You're really not. The moment stretched. Lorelei felt suddenly aware of how alone they were, how dark the room was beyond the circle of lamplight, how he was looking at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. I should go, she said. You should. Neither of them moved. Finally, Zephyrion stepped back deliberately, breaking whatever current had formed between them. Sleep well, Lorelei Brennan. She fled. The recess day turned into something unexpected. Lorelei woke in late afternoon to find Marcus waiting with a message. The king requested her presence for a tour of the realm. Not a work session, an actual tour. She almost declined. But curiosity won over caution. Zephyrion met her in a smaller hall she hadn't seen before, dressed more casually than usual. Still formal by human standards, dark pants, fitted shirt, long coat, but without the ceremonial robes and crown. He looked younger somehow, though age was meaningless for vampires. Ready? He asked. For what exactly? You've been underground for 3 weeks and you haven't seen anything except negotiating rooms and your quarters. I thought you might like to see what you're actually helping protect. He led her through winding passages carved from living rock, past underground gardens lit by bioluminescent fungi, through districts where vampires lived in surprising normalcy. She saw shops and gathering places, libraries carved into cavern walls, art installations that played with shadow and light in ways that only made sense without sunlight. This is beautiful, she said, stopping in a plaza where water fell in sheets from the ceiling into pools that glowed faint blue. This is home, Zephyrion said. The humans see us as monsters in the dark, but we've built a civilization down here. Art, culture, community, everything they have, we have, just without the sun. Why don't you show them this? It might change perspectives. Because some vampires prefer being feared. Fear creates distance. Distance creates safety. He walked along the edge of the glowing pool, and because humans have historically responded to vampire civilization by trying to destroy it, better to be underestimated. Lorelei thought about that. You don't trust them. Us. I don't trust anyone. It's simpler. That sounds lonely. He glanced at her. It is, but loneliness is better than betrayal. They walked through more of the underground realm. Zephyrion showed her the old archives where vampire history was preserved in languages she couldn't read. He took her to the highest point in the cavern system, a platform where you could see the distant ceiling far above, studded with crystals that caught and reflected light like stars. We're directly below the northern city here, he explained. During winter, heat from their buildings warms the rock. You can feel it if you touch the stone. Lorelei pressed her palm against the wall. Sure enough, there was warmth seeping through. The proximity was startling. Humans and vampires separated by just stone and centuries of fear. The treaty we're negotiating, she said slowly. It's not just about borders and feeding rights. It's about whether two species can share space without one destroying the other. Yes. Do you think we can? Zephyrion was quiet for a long moment. I think we have to. The alternative is war that ends with one species extinct and the other diminished. The humans have numbers and technology. We have strength and time. It would be mutually destructive. He looked at her. But coexistence requires trust, and trust requires people willing to bridge the gap. People like you. I'm just a translator. You're more than that. You care. You actually want this to work. Not for career advancement or political points, but because you can't stand the waste of continued conflict. His expression was complex. It's remarkable and exhausting to watch. Lorelei felt heat rise to her face. You make it sound like a character flaw. Maybe it is, or maybe it's the only thing that makes any of this possible. He turned away from the view. Come on. There's one more place I want to show you. He led her deeper into the realm, down passages that grew narrower and older. The architecture changed, became more ancient, less refined. Finally, they emerged into a small chamber lined with stone shelves. Books and scrolls filled every surface. This is my private collection, Zephyrion said. Records and letters from before the first human-vampire wars. Evidence that we did coexist once, a long time ago. Lorelei moved along the shelves, careful not to touch the obviously fragile materials. This is incredible. Historians would kill for access to this. Which is why it stays private. Too much of our history has been distorted or destroyed by people who wanted to control the narrative. He pulled down a leather-bound journal, handled it with surprising gentleness. This belonged to the person I mentioned, the one who thought she could fix everything. The one who died, Lorelei said quietly. Yes. He opened the journal to a random page, showed her handwriting in faded ink. She kept trying to negotiate peace between vampire factions during a civil war. She thought if she could just get everyone to sit down and talk, she could stop the violence. His voice was carefully controlled. She was killed by someone who preferred the war to continue because it gave him power. I'm sorry. It was 300 years ago. I'm over it. The lie was obvious in his tone. My point is that people like you, people who care too much, you make yourselves targets, because caring is vulnerability and vulnerability gets exploited. Lorelei understood what he was really saying. You're warning me. I'm telling you what I should have told her, that not everyone wants peace. Some people profit from conflict, and those people will see you as an obstacle to remove. You think someone will try to sabotage the treaty. I think someone already is. The delays, the missing documents, Seraphine's provocations. He set the journal back on its shelf with care. My council is divided. Some genuinely want this treaty. Others see it as weakness, a surrender to human expansion. They'll undermine it if they can. Then we'll have to work faster than they can sabotage. Zephyrion turned to face her fully. You're not hearing me. I'm telling you that you're in danger and your response is to work harder. What else am I supposed to do? Give up? Let the treaty fail because it's risky? She moved closer to him, frustrated. This matters, Zephyrion, not just politically. It actually matters. If we fail here, people die. Humans and vampires both. I can't just walk away because it's dangerous. That's exactly what I'm talking about. This compulsive need to fix everything even when it costs you. But he didn't sound angry. He sounded almost sad. You're going to burn yourself out trying to save everyone. Then that's my choice to make. They stood facing each other in the dim light of the ancient archives, surrounded by the ghosts of failed peace and old grief. Lorelei could see conflict on his face, something struggling against centuries of careful, emotional control. You remind me of her, he said finally, very quietly. It's terrifying. I'm not her. I'm not going to die trying to fix this. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll be careful. And I can promise that if you're worried about me, that means you care more than you pretend to. Zephyrion's jaw tightened. Don't. Don't what? Don't try to make this about feelings. I'm warning you as someone who's seen this pattern before, that's all. Is it? She held his gaze, because it feels like more than professional concern. It can't be more. The words came out sharp. I don't have the luxury of caring about individuals. I'm responsible for an entire species. Getting attached to one human translator who'll be gone in a few weeks is stupidity I can't afford. The casual cruelty of it stung more than Lorelei expected. She stepped back. Understood. Thank you for the tour, Your Majesty. I should get back to reviewing documents. She turned to leave, but he caught her wrist, not hard but firm enough to stop her. His hand was cool against her skin. Wait. Let go. Lorelei, wait. I didn't mean... He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. I'm trying to protect you. By pushing me away? By keeping this professional. Because if it becomes something else, I won't be able to stay objective and you'll become a target for everyone who wants to see this treaty fail. His grip on her wrist loosened but didn't release. I've spent 300 years not caring about anyone. It's kept me and my people safe. But you're making that very difficult. Lorelei's heart was beating too fast. Why? Because you're brilliant and stubborn and you care about things you shouldn't care about. Because you stood in front of my entire council and told them they were being children and you were right. Because you offered to volunteer for a feeding program just to prove a point. His voice dropped lower. Because when you look at me, you don't see a monster. You see someone you're trying to understand. And no one has tried to understand me in longer than I can remember. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Lorelei felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. Zephyrion, she said carefully, what are you saying? I'm saying this is a problem. You're a problem. And I don't know how to solve it without hurting you or failing my people. And for the first time in centuries, I actually care about both outcomes. He released her wrist and stepped back. So I need you to tell me what to do, because I've forgotten how to handle feeling anything. Lorelei's breath caught. She'd spent 3 weeks watching him be controlled and calculating, revealing nothing. This was something else entirely. This was vulnerability from someone who'd trained himself not to be vulnerable. Nobody's made me feel this way, she said quietly. I've been in war zones and negotiated with dictators, and I've never been afraid I'd care too much about the person across the table. But with you, I keep forgetting this is supposed to be professional. I keep wanting to know more about you, not for the treaty, but just because. And that's terrifying. Nor has anyone made me feel at all, Zephyrion said. Not in 300 years. Not since I decided feeling things was a liability. And then you walked into my hall and started fixing things and looking at me like I was a person instead of a monster. And now I'm standing here telling you things I haven't told anyone in centuries. They stared at each other. The archives were silent, except for their breathing, hers quick and human, his barely there. This is a bad idea, Lorelei said. Terrible idea, he agreed. We still have weeks of negotiations. If people think we're compromised, the treaty fails and we both lose credibility. So, we should keep this professional. Absolutely. Neither of them moved. Then Zephyrion closed the distance between them in one fluid movement and kissed her. It was careful at first, almost questioning, like he was waiting for her to pull away. But Lorelei had spent 3 weeks fighting her growing fascination with this complicated, damaged vampire king, and she was done pretending. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. He was cool under her touch, but not cold, solid, and real. The kiss deepened, Careful control giving way to something rawer. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, fingers threading into her hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard despite his lack of need for air. That was definitely unprofessional, Lorelei managed. Completely inappropriate, Zephyrion agreed. His thumb brushed along her jawline. We should stop. We really should. He kissed her again. They didn't speak about it immediately. There was too much risk, too many complications. Instead, they fell into a pattern that was dangerous and unsustainable. Professional during negotiations, careful and distant where anyone could see. But in the late-night strategy sessions after everyone else had left, something else emerged. They talked. Real conversations that went beyond treaty clauses and territorial disputes. Zephyrion told her about the civil war that had killed his closest friend, about the weight of ruling a species that was slowly dying out. Lorelei told him about growing up rootless, about choosing negotiation work because she'd never learned how to stay still. Sometimes he kissed her, slow and careful like he was learning how. Sometimes she fell asleep at the table and woke to find he'd covered her with his coat and kept working. They were falling into something neither had planned for, but the treaty was progressing. By week 5, they'd resolved most of the territorial disputes. By week 6, they had framework agreements on resource sharing and security protocols. The feeding rights issue remained contentious, but even there they were finding compromise positions. Then everything fell apart. Lorelei was in her quarters reviewing documents when Marcus brought the evening meal. She ate while working, barely tasting the food. 20 minutes later, her vision started blurring. She tried to stand, and her legs gave out. The documents scattered across the floor as she collapsed, her heart racing irregularly. Marcus appeared in her doorway. Oh no, did the food not agree with you? Through the fog of whatever was happening to her body, Lorelei understood. You poisoned me. Just a little, enough to make you sick, not enough to kill. We need you gone, but not martyred. He crouched beside her, checked her pulse clinically. The council sent me. Well, part of the council. The part that thinks this treaty is a mistake and you're too influential. Zephyrion, she tried to say, doesn't know. He'll find out when you're evacuated back to the human world for medical treatment. Such a shame. You tried so hard. Marcus smiled. Nothing personal. You're just in the way. Lorelei tried to respond, but her tongue wasn't working right. The room was spinning. She thought she heard shouting somewhere distant, but consciousness was slipping away. She woke in what had to be a medical facility. Sterile white walls, monitoring equipment beeping steadily. Her body felt like it had been wrung out and put back together wrong. You're awake. Good. Lorelei turned her head slowly. A vampire she didn't recognize sat in a chair by the door. Female, dark-skinned, wearing what looked like medical robes. Who? Lorelei's voice came out scratchy. I am Isabeau, the court physician. You were poisoned with a compound designed to make humans very sick without killing them. Clever, really. Gives plausible deniability. She came over to check the monitors. You'll recover fully in a few days. Where's Zephyrion? Currently tearing apart the palace looking for whoever did this. Isabeau made an adjustment to the IV line. In 300 years, I've never seen him this angry. It's actually a little frightening, and I knew him before he learned emotional control. Lorelei processed that slowly. Marcus. It was Marcus. We know. He confessed before the king had him executed. Also implicated 3 council members, including Seraphine. Isabeau's expression was grim. There's been a purge. Quiet, but thorough. Anyone involved in the plot has been removed from power. The treaty is still on track. The king made it very clear that sabotaging you was sabotaging him personally, and he took that as an act of treason. The remaining council is significantly more cooperative. She checked Lorelei's pupils with a small light. He's been here every night, sitting right where I'm standing, watching you heal. I've never seen him like this. Like what? Afraid, guilty, human almost. Isabeau said it thoughtfully. You've done something to him, changed something fundamental. The question is whether that's good for him or dangerous for you. Before Lorelei could respond, the door opened and Zephyrion entered. He looked different, still regal, still powerful, but something in his usual control had cracked. When he saw she was awake, relief flashed across his face so clearly it was almost painful to witness. You're awake, he said, and his voice was rougher than normal. So I'm told. Lorelei tried to sit up, and Isabeau helped adjust the bed. I'll give you privacy, the physician said, heading for the door, but she needs rest, Your Majesty. Don't overtax her. Then they were alone. Zephyrion crossed the room and stood at her bedside, looking at her like he was cataloging every detail to confirm she was real and alive. "I should have known," he said finally. "I should have seen it coming. Seraphine was too quiet after you challenged her. I should have anticipated she'd retaliate. It's not your fault. It absolutely is. You were in my realm, under my protection, and you were poisoned because of the treaty I asked you to negotiate." His hands were clenched at his sides. "If Isabeau hadn't been able to synthesize the antidote, but she did. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You nearly died because I failed to protect you." He moved away, pacing with restless energy that was completely unlike his usual stillness. "I executed Marcus myself. Seraphine and the others have been exiled, but it doesn't fix what happened." "Zephyrion, stop!" Lorelei waited until he looked at her. "This is what you were warning me about. That caring makes you vulnerable, but it's not a weakness. You stopped the threat. You protected me and the treaty both. I shouldn't have let you become a target in the first place. I became a target the moment I started doing my job well. That's not on you." He came back to her bedside, reached out hesitantly, and then stopped himself. "I thought you were going to die. For 6 hours while Isabeau worked, I thought I'd lost you." His voice was very quiet. "And I realized I couldn't survive that, which is absurd because I've survived centuries, but the thought of you gone made those centuries feel meaningless." Lorelei caught his hand before he could pull it away. His fingers were cool around hers. "I'm here. I'm okay. This time. But we have 2 more weeks of negotiations, and now everyone knows that hurting you hurts me, which makes you an even bigger target. So what do you want to do? Send me away? Fail the treaty because it's dangerous?" "I want to keep you safe," he said, and it sounded like a confession. "But I also need you to finish what we started, and I'm selfish enough to want you here even though it puts you at risk. Then let me stay. Let me finish the treaty." She squeezed his hand. "And stop punishing yourself for caring about someone. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest." He sat down in the chair Isabeau had vacated, still holding her hand. "You terrify me." "Good. You terrify me too. We can be terrified together." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "When you're better, we need to talk about what happens after the treaty is done." "After? You're contracted for 60 days. Then you'll return to your world and I'll stay in mine, but I don't want that." He met her eyes. "I want you to stay. Not as a translator, as something else, something permanent." Lorelei's breath caught. "Zephyrion, I'm human. I age. You don't." "I know. And we'll deal with that when we have to. But I've spent 300 years not feeling anything, and now I feel everything when you're near me, and I'm not giving that up because the logistics are complicated." "Your council will adjust. I'm the king. They'll accept whatever I decide." His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "The question is what you want." What did she want? Lorelei had spent her whole life moving between places, never settling, never belonging. But here in this underground realm with this impossible vampire king, she felt something she'd never felt before. Home, belonging. The sense that someone actually saw her, all of her, and wanted her to stay. "I want to finish the treaty," she said slowly, "and then I want to figure out what this is between us, whatever that takes." "Even if it's complicated?" "Especially if it's complicated. I'm good at complicated." He raised her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "Rest. We have time." The final 2 weeks of negotiations moved faster with Seraphine and her faction gone. The remaining council members were cooperative, even supportive. They finalized feeding rights agreements, established joint security protocols, created frameworks for dispute resolution. The humans, shaken by the revelation of the poisoning attempt, became significantly more willing to compromise. Lorelei recovered quickly. Within 3 days, she was back at the negotiating table, and within a week, it was like the poisoning had never happened, except for the heightened security and Zephyrion's tendency to keep her in his line of sight at all times. Richard Harlow and James Fletcher completed their work and returned to the surface world with preliminary agreements. A new delegation arrived for the final phase, the actual signing and implementation planning. And through it all, Lorelei and Zephyrion continued their careful dance, Professional in public, something else entirely in private. He told her about the early years of his reign, the mistakes he'd made, the people he'd lost. She told him about her fears of never being enough, of always being temporary in other people's lives. "You're not temporary to me," he said one night after a long negotiating session. They were in his private study, surrounded by books and old maps. "I want you to understand that. Whatever you decide about staying or leaving, you've already changed me permanently." "Changed you how?" "I feel things again. I care about outcomes beyond pure strategy. You made me remember what it's like to hope." He pulled her closer, his arms around her waist. "That's not temporary. That's fundamental." Lorelei leaned into him, let herself feel the solidity of him, the unexpected safety of being held by someone powerful enough to destroy her, but careful enough to cherish her instead. "I am staying," she said, "after the treaty is done, if you'll have me." "If?" He turned her to face him. "Lorelei, I'd keep you forever if you'd let me. Forever is a long time for a human. Then we'll figure out how to make your forever as long as possible." He kissed her softly. "I'm not losing you to something as mundane as time. We'll find a way." The final negotiation session took place 60 days after Lorelei had first walked into the Hall of Endless Night. All parties gathered, the Vampire King and his council, the human delegations from 6 cities, international observers, and Lorelei as chief translator and mediator. The treaty document was 300 pages of carefully negotiated compromises. Territorial boundaries with mutual access agreements, feeding programs with enhanced oversight, security cooperation protocols, trade agreements that benefited both species, dispute resolution mechanisms designed to prevent future conflicts. It was, Lorelei thought, possibly the best work she'd ever done. Richard Harlow spoke for the human delegation. "This treaty represents a new era of cooperation between our species. It's not perfect, but it's progress. On behalf of the human cities, I'm authorized to sign." Zephyrion stood from his throne. "For 300 years, I've ruled the court of Ashen Crowns with the understanding that survival required isolation, that caring about anything beyond my own people was weakness." He paused, his eyes finding Lorelei's across the hall. "I was wrong. This treaty proves that cooperation serves us better than isolation. That trust, carefully built, creates strength neither species could achieve alone." He descended from the throne and approached the signing table, but instead of sitting immediately, he turned to address the full assembly. "There is something else that needs to be said, something personal that has political implications." His voice carried through the hall. "During these negotiations, I've formed an attachment to the human translator. More than attachment. I've fallen in love with her." Shocked silence. Lorelei's heart stopped. This wasn't the plan. They were supposed to keep it quiet until after the treaty was finalized. Zephyrion continued, "I know the traditional view is that a vampire king shouldn't have emotional attachments, that feelings make us weak. But I've learned the opposite is true. Caring about Lorelei made me a better negotiator, a better king, because she made me remember why any of this matters." "Your Majesty," one of the council members started, but Zephyrion raised a hand. "I'm staking my crown on this. If the council believes my love for a human makes me unfit to rule, challenge me now, but know that I will not renounce her. She stays at my side, as my partner, my equal, my queen if she'll have me." Complete chaos erupted. Council members were on their feet. The human delegations were arguing amongst themselves. Lorelei stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Zephyrion's eyes met hers across the chaos. In them, she saw certainty, determination, and something that looked like hope. Finally, a voice cut through the noise. It was Matthias, one of the older council members. "The king has made his position clear. I, for one, see no weakness in it. If anything, his willingness to be honest about his feelings shows strength. I support King Zephyrion and his choice of consort." Slowly, other voices joined in. Not all, but enough. The council was divided, but the majority supported their king. From the human side, Richard Harlow stood. "Well, this is unprecedented, but I suppose it's fitting that a treaty about cooperation between species should be sealed with a personal bond. Congratulations, Your Majesty, and to you, Lorelei. You've done more than negotiate peace. You've built a bridge none of us thought possible." Lorelei found her voice. I didn't expect this to be public." "Neither did I," Zephyrion said, moving toward her, "but I realized that if we're going to make this work, it has to be built on honesty. No more hiding, no more pretending I don't care." He reached her and took her hands. "Marry me, not just as a political alliance. Marry me because I love you and I want to build something new with you." She should have been thinking about logistics, about the scandal, about her career and his reputation, and all the complicated political ramifications. Instead, she thought about late nights in the archives, about his careful hands covering her with his coat when she fell asleep working, about the way he'd looked at her after the poisoning, like losing her would unmake him, about feeling seen and valued and home for the first time in her life. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her in front of everyone, and if there were objections, Lorelei didn't hear them over the sound of her own heart. The treaty was signed with considerably more pageantry than originally planned. The document that had taken 60 days of grueling negotiation became something else. Proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged with patience, honesty, and the willingness to see the person behind the monster. 3 months later, Lorelei Brennan married King Zephyrion Yvaros in a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions. It was held underground in the Hall of Endless Night, which had been transformed with lights and flowers and music. Human guests mingled cautiously with vampires. Old enemies stood side by side and watched two people from different worlds promise themselves to each other. Isabeau, the court physician, served as witness. "I never thought I'd see him like this," she said to Lorelei before the ceremony. "Happy, open, human almost. You've given him something I thought he'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope. The belief that things can get better, that love isn't weakness but strength." Isabeau smiled. "Hold on to that. You're going to need it." She was right. The first year was complicated. Learning to navigate vampire court politics, dealing with human media fascination with the translator who married a vampire king, managing the implementation of the treaty while also trying to build a marriage with someone who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable. But they made it work. Lorelei established a new role, official liaison between human cities and the vampire realm, continuing the diplomatic work she'd started. Zephyrion proved to be a better husband than either of them expected, attentive and surprisingly romantic once he let himself feel. They had their first real fight about 4 months in, over Lorelei's tendency to overwork herself. Zephyrion accused her of trying to save everyone again. She accused him of being overprotective. It ended with both of them admitting they were scared of losing each other and then falling into bed to prove they were both still there. They learned each other. Lorelei learned that Zephyrion liked old poetry and had a weakness for terrible puns. Zephyrion learned that Lorelei sang in the shower and cried at sad movies and needed to be reminded to eat when she was working. The issue of her mortality hung over them like a shadow. But Isabeau was researching vampire blood's healing properties, looking for ways to extend human lifespans without full conversion. It was slow work, but promising. "We have time," Zephyrion would say when Lorelei worried. "However long we have, we'll make it count." 2 years after the treaty signing, Lorelei stood in the same hall where she'd first met Zephyrion, watching a new group of diplomats begin negotiations for expanded trade agreements. She was there as an observer now, offering advice when asked, but letting others do the work. Zephyrion joined her, sliding an arm around her waist. "How are they doing?" "Better than we did at the start. We set a good precedent." "We set an impossible precedent, human and vampire marriage. Who does that?" "We do." She leaned into him. "How was the council meeting?" "Tedious. Matthias wants to establish formal diplomatic relations with 3 more human cities. Isabeau presented her research findings on life extension. And there was a petition requesting that we host a cultural exchange program." He kissed the top of her head. "Your influence is spreading." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation. You've changed this entire realm, made us more open, more connected to the human world. Some see it as weakness. I see it as evolution." "And what do you see when you look at me?" Lorelei asked, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. "I see my wife, my queen, the person who taught me how to feel again." His expression was soft in a way it never was in public. "I see home." 3 years after that, Isabeau presented her breakthrough, a treatment derived from vampire blood that could extend human life significantly. Not immortality, but centuries instead of decades. Lorelei would age slowly, stay vital longer. It will change you, Isabeau warned. Not into a vampire, but not quite human anymore either. You'll need blood supplements. Sunlight will become uncomfortable. You'll be something between. Can she refuse? Zephyrion asked, his hand tight around Lorelei's. Of course. But without it, you have maybe 40 or 50 years together. With it, you have centuries. Lorelei didn't need to think long. I want centuries. The treatment took months, but it worked. Lorelei felt the changes gradually increase strength, sharper senses, the way bright sunlight started to hurt her eyes. She mourned some of her humanity, but gained something else. Time. Actual time with the person she loved. 10 years after the original treaty, the vampire realm and human cities had formed a functioning alliance. Trade flourished. Cultural exchanges were common. Younger vampires spoke casually about human friends. Human children grew up knowing vampires as neighbors, not monsters. Lorelei and Zephyrion's marriage became a symbol of the possible. Proof that the deepest divides could be crossed with courage and honesty. They stood together on the platform overlooking the underground city, watching lights flicker in windows carved into stone. Lorelei's hair was still dark, but her eyes had taken on a faint silver tint from the treatments. She'd lived underground for a decade now and couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Do you regret it? Zephyrion asked quietly. Giving up the sun? Your human life? I gave up one life for a better one. No regrets. She laced her fingers through his. You asked me once what I wanted. I want this. Forever, however long that is. I can give you forever, he said, pulling her close. Or at least several centuries. We'll figure out the rest as we go. That's very romantic for someone who spent 300 years not feeling anything. You're very annoying for someone I'm desperately in love with. She laughed and kissed him. Around them, the underground city hummed with life vampire and human mixed working together, building something new. 20 years later, Lorelei stood in the Hall of Endless Night again, but this time she was the one at the head of the table. Zephyrion sat beside her, silver-haired and ageless as ever, watching with quiet pride as she mediated a dispute between vampire factions. She'd become queen in truth, not just title. Not. The vampire court respected her because she'd earned it, negotiating conflicts, establishing policies that protected both species, proving over and over that strength came from cooperation, not isolation. When the session ended and the hall emptied, Zephyrion caught her hand. You were magnificent. I was adequate. You resolved a 50-year territorial dispute in under 3 hours. That's magnificent. He pulled her into his arms. Have I told you today that I love you? Only twice. You're falling behind. Terrible of me. I love you. He kissed her softly. I love you. Another kiss. I love you. Better. They walked through their realm together, past the gardens and libraries, through corridors they knew by heart. After 2 decades, this place was wholly theirs, shaped by their choices and care. In their private quarters, surrounded by books and maps and accumulated memories, Zephyrion pulled Lorelei close. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For walking into my hall 20 years ago and refusing to be afraid. For seeing past the monster to the person. For teaching me that feeling things doesn't make you weak. It makes you alive. His voice was rough with emotion. For loving me when I'd forgotten how to love anything. Lorelei cupped his face in her hands. You taught me something too. That home isn't a place. It's a person who sees you and chooses you and builds a life with you. She smiled. Thank you for choosing me. I'll choose you every day for the next century, he promised. Just 1 century? We'll renegotiate after that. I'm told I'm good at treaties. She laughed and pulled him into a kiss that tasted like forever and promises kept and the kind of love that bridged impossible divides. Outside their window, the underground city sparkled with life and light. 2 species learning to share space, building something better than either could create alone. And at the heart of it all, a vampire king who'd learned to feel and a human translator who taught him how, proving that the deepest magic wasn't in power or immortality. It was in choosing love despite the complications, in building bridges despite the risks, in whispering, "Nobody's made me feel this way," and hearing back, "Nor has anyone made me feel at all," and deciding that feeling everything was worth the vulnerability. They had centuries ahead of them, challenges to face, conflicts to resolve, a realm to rule together. But they'd face it the way they'd faced everything else, with honesty, courage, and the unshakable certainty that whatever came, they'd handle it together. In the end, the girl who'd walked into the Hall of Endless Night with 3 languages in her mouth and no illusions had gained something she'd never expected: a home, a crown, and a love that would outlast empires. And the king who'd spent 300 years numbing himself against feeling anything had learned the most important lesson of all: that opening your heart to one person could change everything. That love wasn't weakness, but the strongest foundation for building something that lasted. They'd bridged the gap between human and vampire, between fear and trust, between 2 people who'd both forgotten how to hope. And they'd done it one honest conversation, one brave choice, one whispered confession at a time. The treaty they'd negotiated held strong, but the real victory was smaller and more profound. 2 people from impossible worlds who'd found each other and decided that despite every logical reason not to, they were going to love each other anyway, and they did. For decades, that turned into centuries, through challenges and changes, through the slow evolution of their world from divided to unified. In the archives where Zephyrion had first showed her his private collection, new volumes appeared over the years. Journals documenting their reign, letters between them when Judy called them apart, records of a love that had started with a negotiation and grown into something legendary. Future historians would study them. The vampire king and his human queen who'd transformed an entire society. But the people who lived through it, who saw them walk through the underground city hand in hand, who watched them rule with wisdom born from genuinely caring about their people, they understood the real story. It wasn't about treaties or politics or species reconciliation, though all that mattered. It was about 2 people who'd been alone in different ways, finding each other at exactly the right moment. About having the courage to say, "I feel something," when feeling anything was dangerous. About building a life together despite every obstacle. On their 50th anniversary, they returned to the Hall of Endless Night where they'd first met. The space had been transformed over the decades, but they could still see echoes of that first night: the obsidian columns, the silver veined marble, the shadows that torchlight couldn't quite touch. "Do you remember what you thought when you first saw me?" Zephyrion asked, pulling Lorelei close to his side. "I thought you were terrifying and beautiful, and that I was probably going to die in this hall." She smiled. "I was wrong about the dying part. You were terrifying too, so small and human and stubborn. Walking into a room full of vampires like you owned the place." He kissed her temple. "I knew you'd change everything. I just didn't know how completely." "Regrets?" "None. You?" "Not one." They stood together in the hall where it had all begun, where a girl with 3 languages and no illusions had met a king who'd forgotten how to feel, and something impossible had happened. They'd fallen in love, and in loving each other, they had changed the world. The end.